The following summary will illustrate the basics of the transatlantic slave trade. Until it was banned by the English Parliament in 1789 and the United States in 1808, it could be said that it was divided into about 8 steps. The map shows that the slave trade formed a triangle in the Atlantic Ocean. At the top of the triangle were either the shipping ports of Bristol, Rhode Island, New York, or Liverpool, England. The slave ships left their ports with rum, guns, knives, textiles, and jewelry, and would proceed to the Windward Coast, Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, or Slave Coast of Africa for trading for slaves. From West Africa to the West Indies, it was called the Middle Passage, a trip of varying length but about 7 weeks. At the Caribbean ports of Havana and Jamaica, slaves are bartered and traded. Sugar or molasses are purchased to ship back to the United States or Great Britain to be turned back into rum, and the triangle starts all over again. So step 1 is when African tribal leaders routinely kidnap men, women, and children from their neighboring tribes and villages in raids. This is called panniering. The slaves of the famous Amistad were kidnapped in this way from Sierra Leone in 1839. This was made into a movie. Their leader, Sinke, never saw his wife again. Step 2. The African tribal leaders then sell their kidnapped collection to the Portuguese, Spanish, English, or to the New Yankees. Step 3. The captured slaves are marched to the ports on the slave coast in coffles and chains of slaves, chained or yoked together at the neck with forked wooden sticks. Marches sometimes lasted weeks. Step 4. Slaves are taken and collected to be exhibited to the slave traders at the slave castles or fortresses to wait for slave ships to arrive. Step 5. Slave ships, slavers as they are called, are fully packed from 200 up to 900 and sail to the major slave harbors or ports in the West Indies, Brazil, or Lisbon. Havana, Cuba was the largest slave port in the world. However, before they got across the Middle Passage to the West Indies, the sick and dying slaves are routinely thrown overboard, or if there is a shortage of food due to the voyage taking too long. Step 6. Slave traders or buyers barter for slaves or buy them at auction. Step 7. Slaves are now shipped into their final destination in the colonies or to British, Dutch, French, or Portuguese colonies. Brazil, the largest Portuguese colony, received 4 million slaves during the 17th to 19th centuries. In the 18th century, Virginia received more than 45,000 slaves, and Charleston, South Carolina, about 65,500 slaves before the slave trade became illegal. It should be noted that due to diseases, running out of food and water, just dying of heat, or bad air and ship captains, it is more to their advantage to toss these slaves, which can be 20 to 30% overboard, and collect on their insurance from underwriters of the ships. Step 9. Finally, the slaves that did survive the Middle Passage and the trip up from the colonies were put to use. There is one example of the slave trade gone bad that should be long remembered. The Zong had picked up its full load of slaves of 442 in September 1781 at the Portuguese island of San Tome, lost its way in the West Indies, mistaking Santo Domingo for Jamaica, and ran out of food and water. Captain Collinswood, to save face, decided to throw 195 of the 442 into the sea on some pretext that the charge to the underwriters with the loss. 10 jumped overboard on their own, leaving a little more than half left over for sale. Historians believe that it was this sort of antics that brought about the first serious discussions about the abolition of the slave trade, which did occur in the English Parliament in 1789.
Volumes 1 through 10 on the road to the abolition of slavery. Volumes 1 and 2. Introduction on the road to the abolition of slavery. Slavery explained in the words, writing, and songs of contemporary politicians, abolitionists, slaves, pro-slavery advocates, and others. Volume 3, Politics, on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. The Institution of Slavery and How It Was Written into the U.S. Constitution. Volume 4, Heroes and Heroines on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. Liberated from the shackles of slavery, countless slaves made extraordinary contributions to society. Volume 5, Obstacles on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. Slavery, culturally entrenched and protected by religious, political, and social obstacles. Volume 6, Martyrs on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. People black and white gave their lives in the fight for freedom from slavery. Volume 7, Kidnappers and Justice on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. The law protected slavery, and the scales of justice were in favor of the slave owners. Harriet Beecher Stowe, The Evil of Slavery. Stowe reveals the people and the conditions that inspired her explosive novel about slavery and life in the South. Volume 8, The Legacy of What Slavery Left Behind. War-ravaged people struggle to rebuild their society and come to terms with the repercussion of slavery after the Civil War. Volume 9, Those Dedicated Angels on the Road to the Abolition of Slavery. Recognizing the work of 12 abolitionists whose extraordinary dedication helped to free the enslaved, these are the people who fought for a higher standard of mankind. Volume 10, coming soon, summer 2013. The Beginning of Slavery. Indentured servants and the transatlantic slave trade. Colonial plantations needed labor, more orphans, loose women, convicts, and Quakers than the Old World could send as indentured servants. So the colonists looked to Africa, and the transatlantic slave trade thrived for 450 years.